Not everyone who smiles at you is meant to walk closely with you. That truth is hard to accept, especially if you have a kind heart. You want to be there for people. You want to help, to listen, to give, to be understood as someone who cares. And slowly, without even realizing it, you begin to open every door, lower every boundary, and make yourself available to everyone until one day you feel drained, overlooked, and quietly exhausted. Because being too friendly can cost you more than you think. Cost you more than you think. Cost you more than you think. Can cost you more than you think. It can cost your peace. It can cost your focus. It can even cost your focus. It can even cost your purpose. What if the issue is not that you love too much, but that you give access without discernment? Because real wisdom is not just about being kind. It's about knowing who deserves a place in your life and who doesn't. So take a moment and be honest with yourself. Have you been giving too much of yourself to the wrong people? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might help someone else recognize the boundaries they need to set. There is a difference between being kind and being careless with your boundaries. And many people never learn that difference until it costs them something. We live in a world that often celebrates being nice above being wise. But nice above being wise. You are taught to be agreeable, to avoid conflict, to keep everyone happy, to say yes even when your spirit is quietly saying no. And over time you begin to believe that being overly friendly is a virtue in itself. But there is a silent danger in being too accessible, too available, and too eager to please. Because when you are friendly without discernment, you begin to give access to people who were never assigned to your life. Jesus himself was loving, compassionate, and approachable. Yet he was never careless with access. In John 2:24-25 it says, "But Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all people. He did not need any testimony about mankind, for he knew what was in each person." Think about that. He loved everyone, but he did not trust everyone. He served many, but he did not give himself to all. Because love does not require unlimited access. And wisdom teaches you that not everyone who is around you is for you. Being too friendly often comes from a good place. A desire to be accepted, a desire to be liked, a desire to avoid rejection. But when those desires go unchecked, they begin to override discernment. You start saying yes when you should say no. You start entertaining conversations that drain your spirit. You start allowing people into spaces of your life that should be protected. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to lose yourself. Proverbs 4:23 says, "Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it." Guard your heart. Not isolated it, not harden it, guard it, because your heart is valuable. Your peace is valuable, your calling is valuable, and anything valuable requires boundaries. Being too friendly can make you vulnerable to manipulation. There are people who recognize kindness not as a gift, but as an opportunity. They see your openness as access. They see your willingness as availability. And they take more than they give. This is why discernment is essential. Discernment helps you recognize who is genuine and who is simply convenient. It helps you see beyond words into intentions. It helps you understand that not everyone deserves the same level of closeness. Jesus had 12 disciples, but even among them, he had 3 who were closer. And even among the 3, there were moments he walked alone. This is not favoritism. This is order. Because relationships function best when they are aligned with purpose, not just emotion. Being too friendly can also lead to overexposure. You share too much too soon. You reveal your struggles to people who have not proven their loyalty. You trust people based on how they make you feel in the moment, rather than how they have demonstrated consistency over time. And when that trust is mishandled, you feel hurt, confused, and sometimes betrayed. But the issue is not always their behavior. Sometimes it is your boundaries. Sometimes it is your boundaries. Ecclesiastes 3:7 says, "There is a time to be silent and a time to speak." Not everything needs to be shared. Not every thought needs to be expressed. Not every person needs to know your story. Wisdom knows when to speak and when to remain quiet. Being too friendly can also weaken your authority. Being too friendly can also weaken your authority. When you are constantly trying to be liked, you may avoid necessary confrontation. You tolerate what should be corrected. You overlook what should be addressed. You remain silent when truth needs to be spoken. But Galatians 1:10 asks a powerful question. Am I now trying to win the approval of human beings or of God? Because you cannot lead effectively if your primary goal is to be liked. Sometimes doing what is right will make you misunderstood. Sometimes speaking truth will create distance. But obedience to God must always come before approval from people. From people. Even Jesus faced rejection. Even Jesus was misunderstood. Yet he never compromised truth to maintain comfort. Being too friendly can also distract you from purpose. Being too friendly can also distract you from purpose. You spend time maintaining relationships that do not align with your calling. You invest energy into conversations that do not build you. You surround yourself with people who keep you comfortable instead of people who challenge you to grow. 1 Corinthians 15:33 warns, do not be misled. Bad company corrupts good character. This does not mean you withdraw from the world. It means you choose your inner circle wisely, because proximity influences perspective, and perspective shapes direction. The people closest to you will either sharpen you or slowly weaken your focus. Being too friendly can also make you emotionally exhausted. You become available to everyone's needs but neglect your own. You listen to everyone's problems but have no space to process your own. You give encouragement but rarely receive it. And over time, you feel drained because you were never designed to be everything for everyone. Jesus often withdrew to pray, Luke 5:16. He stepped away from crowds. He created space. He understood the importance of renewal. And if he needed it, how much more do you? Setting boundaries is not selfish. It is stewardship. It is recognizing that your energy, your time, and your attention are limited resources, and you must invest them wisely. Being too friendly can also blur spiritual discernment. You begin to accept values that do not align with your faith. You tolerate conversations that weaken your convictions. You laugh at things that once would have troubled your spirit, because constant exposure shapes sensitivity. Because constant exposure shapes sensitivity. Romans 12:2 says, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Transformation requires intentional separation, not isolation, but distinction. You are called to be in the world, but not of it, and that requires boundaries. Jesus was approachable, but he was also distinct. People felt his love, but they also recognized his authority. He was compassionate, but he was not compromised. And this balance is what many struggle to maintain. You can be kind without being naive. You can be loving without being accessible to everyone. You can be compassionate without allowing people to misuse your presence. Even Proverbs 13:20 says, walk with the wise and become wise, for a companion of fools suffers harm. Who you walk with matters. Who you allow close matters. Who you give your time to matters. Because not everyone is assigned to matters. Because not everyone is assigned to your journey. Some people are seasonal. Some are distractions. And wisdom helps you discern the difference. Being too friendly often comes from a fear of being alone. But solitude is not the same as loneliness. There are moments when God separates you to protect you. Moments when distance is not rejection, but redirection. Moments when fewer people around you actually bring greater clarity within you. Because when your environment is quiet, your spirit can hear more clearly. Psalm 46:10 says, be still and know that I am God. Stillness requires space. Space requires boundaries. And boundaries require courage. Stillness and boundaries require courage. Courage to say no without guilt. Courage to walk away without explanation. Courage to prioritize purpose over popularity. Because at the end of the day, you are not called to be liked by everyone. You are called to be faithful to God. And faithfulness requires discernment. It requires discernment. It requires discipline. It requires understanding that access to your life is a privilege, not a right. Not everyone who smiles at you deserves proximity. Not everyone who speaks to you deserves influence. Not everyone who is kind to you deserves closeness, because closeness is built on trust. And trust is built over time, not emotion, not convenience, not pressure. Time, consistency, character. And when you begin to understand this, your relationships begin to change. You become more intentional, more selective, more aware. You stop giving access so quickly. You stop overextending yourself. You stop apologizing for having boundaries, because you realize that protecting your peace is not pride. It is wisdom. And wisdom begins to guide your interactions. You still love. You still care. You still serve. But you do so with clarity, with balance, with purpose, because being too friendly is not the same as being Christ-like. Christ-likeness is rooted in love, guided by truth. And truth teaches you that not every door should be opened. Not every voice should be opened. Not every voice should be trusted. And not every connection should be maintained, because every connection you maintain either contributes to your growth or quietly competes with it. And many people never realize how much of their energy is being drained, not by obvious enemies, but by unnecessary access. You don't always lose strength through conflict. Sometimes you lose it through constant exposure to the wrong environment, through conversations that carry no life, through conversations that demand more than they give, through people who are present but not purposeful. And when you are too friendly, you rarely pause long enough to evaluate these things. You simply keep giving, keep showing up, keep making yourself available, until one day you feel depleted with how, that T understanding why. But depletion is often the result of mismanaged excess. Even Jesus asked his disciples in Luke 8:45, "Who touched me?" When power went out from him. That moment reveals something profound. Not every touch is the same. There were crowds around him, but one touch carried faith, while others were simply proximity. And if Jesus was aware of what was leading him, you must also become aware of what is being taken from you. Your time, your emotional capacity, your spiritual focus. These are not endless resources. And if you do not guard them, you will find yourself constantly empty. Being too friendly also affects your decision making. When you allow too many voices into your life, clarity becomes difficult. Everyone has an opinion. Everyone has a perspective. But not every voice is aligned with your purpose. James 1:5 encourages us to ask God for wisdom, not the crowd, because too many voices create confusion. And confusion leads to hesitation. And hesitation delays progress. When you choose to limit access, you create space for clarity. You begin to hear God more clearly. You begin to recognize direction more confidently, because your mind is no longer crowded with conflicting influences. Being too friendly can also create misplaced loyalty. You stay connected to people out of history instead of purpose. You remain loyal to relationships that no longer align with where God is taking you. You feel obligated to maintain connections simply because they have existed for a long time. But time does not equal assignment. Just because someone has been part of your past does not mean they are meant for your future. God told Abraham in Genesis 12, to leave his country, his people, and his father's household to step into promise. That required separation. That required courage. That required choosing obedience over familiarity. And sometimes choosing God above relationships means releasing connections that no longer serve his purpose in your life. That does not mean you become cold or bitter. It means you become intentional. You recognize that not every relationship is meant to continue at the same level. Some shift, some fade, some end, some emotion, some fade, some end. And all of it can be guided by wisdom, not emotion. Being too friendly can also open doors to unnecessary conflict. When boundaries are unclear, expectations become unrealistic. People begin to assume access. They begin to expect availability. They begin to rely on you in ways that may not be healthy. They begin to rely on you in ways that may not be healthy. And when you finally try to create distance, they feel rejected, not because you did something wrong, but because you never established limits in the beginning. Clear boundaries prevent confusion. They communicate respect. They define space, and they protect both you and the other person from misunderstanding. Jesus often walked away from crowds when his assignment required it. He did not explain himself to everyone. He did not seek permission to step away. He understood that purpose sometimes requires distance, and you must understand that as well. Not every invitation requires acceptance. Not every opportunity requires participation. Not every relationship requires closeness. Not every relationship requires close. Discernment teaches you where to invest. Being too friendly can also lead to emotional entanglement. You begin to carry burdens that were never yours. You absorb other people's problems. You feel responsible for fixing situations that are beyond your control. And over time, this creates stress because you were never called to be everyone's solution. Galatians 6:5 reminds us that each one should carry their own load. There is a difference between helping and carrying. Helping is support. Caring is responsible. And when you cross that line, you begin to feel overwhelmed because you are carrying weight that God never assigned to you. Being too friendly can blur that line. It makes you feel guilty for stepping back. It makes you feel obligated to stay involved. It makes you feel responsible for outcomes that are not yours. But wisdom frees you from that pressure. It reminds you that you can care without carrying. You can support without sacrificing your peace. You can love without losing yourself. Being too friendly also affects your spiritual sensitivity. The more you expose yourself to different influences without discernment, the more your inner clarity becomes clouded. You start tolerating things you once resisted. You start normalizing what you once questioned, because constant exposure shapes perception, and perception influences behavior. This is why boundaries are not just emotional, they are spiritual, they protect your alignment, they preserve your focus. They guard your calling. Ephesians 6:11 says, put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. Notice that it says stand. Standing requires awareness. It requires readiness. It requires readiness. It requires protection. And part of that protection is knowing what and who you allow into your space. Because not every influence is harmless. Not every connection is neutral. Some strengthen you. Others slowly weaken you. Being too friendly can make it difficult to recognize this difference. But discernment sharpens your awareness. It helps you sense when something is off. It helps you recognize when peace is disturbed. It helps you step back before damage is done. And as you grow in this awareness, you begin to live with greater intention. You choose conversations that build, you invest in relationships that align. You create space for what truly matters. Because you understand that your life is not meant to be scattered across countless connections. It is meant to be focused, directed, purposeful. Jesus did not try to reach everyone personally. Jesus did not try to reach everyone personally. He invested deeply in a few, impacted many, and trusted God with the rest. That is order. That is wisdom. And when you embrace that, you release the pressure to be everything for everyone. You accept that your assignment has limits. You accept that your energy has boundaries. You accept that your time has value. And you begin to steward those things with care. Being too friendly often comes from a desire to avoid discomfort. But growth requires discomfort. But growth requires saying no. It requires stepping back. It requires disappointing people at times. But when your decisions are guided by purpose, not approval, you gain clarity. Because your life is not defined by how many people you please. It is defined by how faithfully you walk in what God has called you to do. And that requires focus. Focus requires boundaries, and boundaries require courage. So you begin to shift, not into isolation, but into intentional connection. Not into intentional connection, not into coldness, but into clarity. Not into rejection of people, but into proper placement of people. But into proper placement of people, you still love, you still care, you still serve. But you no longer give access without evaluation. You no longer open doors without discernment. You no longer remain in spaces that drain your spirit, because you understand that being too friendly is not love. It is often a lack of boundaries disguised as kindness. And true kindness is guided by wisdom. It knows when to give, when to step back, when to speak, when to remain silent, when to stay, and when to remain silent, when to stay, and when to walk away. Because not every connection is meant to continue, and not every relationship is meant to have the same level of access to your life. And as you begin to truly understand this, your life starts to feel different in a quiet but powerful way. There is less confusion, less pressure, less emotional exhaustion. Less emotional exhaustion. Not because people have changed, but because you have. Because now you are no longer operating from a place of trying to be everything to everyone. You are operating from a place of alignment, knowing who you are, knowing what God has called you to, and knowing what deserves access to your time and your heart. And that clarity protects you. It protects your peace when others try to pull you into unnecessary drama. It protects your focus when distractions try to compete for your attention. It protects your calling when relationships try to redirect your priorities. Because once you understand that your life has purpose, you begin to treat your time like it matters. Ephesians 5:15-16 says, "Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise but as wise, making the most of every opportunity." Making the most of every opportunity. Making the most of every opportunity means you cannot afford to waste your energy on what does not align. It means you cannot afford to be everywhere. Say yes to everything and stay connected to everyone. Wisdom demands selectivity, and selectivity is not rejection. It is direction. Being too friendly often leads to overcommitment. You say yes to things you do not have the capacity, for you agree to plans that drain you. You take on responsibilities that were never yours. And over time, your schedule becomes full, but your spirit becomes empty, because fullness without purpose leads to burnout. Jesus was never rushed. He was never overwhelmed. He was never controlled by external demands. Why? Because he was guided by divine priority. In John 5:19, he says, "The Son can do nothing by himself. He can do only what he sees his Father doing." That means even Jesus did not respond to every need. He responded to what aligned with his assignment. And that is a powerful lesson. Not every need is your responsibility. Not every problem requires your involvement. Not every request deserves your yes. When you are too friendly, you respond emotionally. When you are wise, you respond intentionally, and intentional living preserves your strength. It allows you to show up fully where it matters most. Being too friendly can also cause you to ignore warning signs. Being too friendly can also cause you to ignore warning signs. Sometimes people show you who they are early, but because you want to maintain peace, you overlook it. You're ignoring consistencies. You overlook it. You're ignoring consistencies. It's behavior that should be addressed. And later you find yourself hurt by something you sense from the beginning. Discernment often speaks quietly. It gives you a feeling, a hesitation, a lack of peace. And when you ignore that, you override God's guidance, because God does not always speak loudly. Sometimes he speaks through your spirit. Colossians 3:15 says, "Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts." If peace is the ruler, then anything that consistently disturbs it deserves your attention. Not everything that feels good is right. Not everyone who is kind is trustworthy. Not everyone who is kind is trustworthy. Not every opportunity is beneficial. And being too friendly can blind you to these distinctions, but wisdom opens your eyes. It teaches you to pay attention, to observe, to evaluate, to pause before you proceed. And that pause can protect you from unnecessary pain. Being too friendly also makes it difficult to walk in authority. Authority requires clarity. It requires conviction. It requires the ability to stand firm even when others disagree. But when your focus is on being liked, your authority becomes compromised. You hesitate to speak truth. You avoid difficult conversations. You soften standards to maintain comfort. But truth does not touch to angst to accommodate preference. And when God calls you to lead, to influence, or to stand, you must be willing to prioritize truth over approval. Titus 2:7-8 speaks about showing integrity and soundness of speech that cannot be condemned. That kind of life requires boldness. It requires a willingness to be misunderstood. Because not everyone will appreciate your boundaries. Because not everyone will appreciate your boundaries. Not everyone will agree with your decisions. Not everyone will agree with your decisions. Not everyone will understand your distance. But you are not called to be understood by everyone. You are called to be obedient to God. And obedience sometimes creates distance. It creates separation between you and environments that no longer align. It creates space between you and people who do not respect your boundaries. It creates clarity in areas where confusion once existed. And that clarity is necessary for growth, because growth requires pruning. John 15:2 says that God cuts off every branch that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, He prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. Pruning is not comfortable. It involves cutting away, letting go, releasing what once felt connected. But it is necessary for greater growth. And sometimes being less friendly is part of that pruning. It is not about becoming distant from everyone. It is not about becoming distant from everyone. It is about becoming focused on what truly matters. Being too friendly can also keep you from developing depth. Being too friendly can also keep you from developing depth. When your attention is spread across too many relationships, you rarely invest deeply in the right ones. You have many connections, but few meaningful relationships. You are known by many, but understood by few, because depth requires time. It requires intentionality. It requires presence, and when you limit access wisely, you create room for deeper, more meaningful connections. Proverbs 27:17 says, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. Sharpen. It does not happen in shallow interaction. It happens in intentional relationship, in accountability, in an honesty, in growth. And those kinds of relationships require discernment. Not everyone can sharpen you. Some people will only distract you. Some will drain you. Some will delay you. Some will delay you. But the right people will strengthen you, challenge you, encourage you, and align with your purpose. Being too friendly often keeps you surrounded by noise instead of growth. But when you become intentional, your environment begins to change. Your conversations become richer. Your connections become stronger. Your connections become stronger. Your direction becomes clearer. And your life becomes more aligned, because you are no longer operating from a place of trying to maintain everything. You are operating from a place of purpose. And purpose simplifies your decisions. It answers questions like, who should I spend time with? What should I invest in time with? What should I invest in? Where should I focus my energy? Because when purpose is clear, distractions lose their power, and being too friendly often invites distractions. Core style. Distractions, it keeps doors open that should be closed. It keeps conversations going that should have ended. It keeps connections alive that no longer serve growth. But wisdom teaches you to close doors without guilt. But wisdom teaches you to close doors without guilt. To step back without explanation. To choose peace over pressure. Because your life is not meant to be controlled by external expectations. It is meant to be guided by internal conviction. It is meant to be guided by internal conviction. And that conviction comes from your relationship with God. The more you grow in Him, the more your discernment sharpens. The more your priorities align, the more your priorities align, the more your boundaries strengthen, and the more confident you become in your decisions. Because you are no longer asking, will they understand? You are asking, does this align with what God is calling me to? And that question changes everything. It frees you from the need to explain every decision. It frees you from the pressure to please everyone. It frees you from the guilt of saying no, because you understand that every yes costs something. It costs time, energy, attention, focus, and you cannot afford to give those things away carelessly. So you become more aware, more intentional, more grounded. You still smile, you still show kindness, you still reflect love. But now it is guided by wisdom. By descending so, you still show kindness, you still reflect love. But now it is guided by wisdom. By descending so, reflect love by purpose, because you understand that being too friendly is not the goal. Being faithful is, and faithfulness requires you to protect what God has entrusted to you, your heart, your mind, your calling. And as you protect these things, your life begins to move with greater clarity, greater strength, and greater purpose. Not because you have become distant, but because you have finally learned the power of wise boundaries. Not because you have finally learned the power of wise boundaries. And once you begin to walk in that awareness, you start to notice something deeper happening within you. A quiet confidence that was not there before. It is not loud, it is not arrogant, but it is steady. Because when you stop trying to be everything to everyone, you finally have the space to become who God created you to be. And that is where real peace begins. And that is where real peace begins. Not the kind of peace that depends on everyone liking you, but the kind of peace that comes from knowing you are aligned with God. Because there is a difference between being accepted by people and being approved by God. And many spend their life chasing the first while neglecting the second. But Matthew 7:14 reminds us that the path to life is narrow and few find it. Why? Because it requires discipline. It requires intentionality. It requires intentionality. It requires making choices that are not always popular. And one of those choices is learning and to step back, when to say no, when to create distance, when to protect your space. Being too friendly often makes you ignore your own needs. You check on everyone else, but you neglect your own spiritual condition. You pour into others, but you rarely pause to be refilled. And over time, you begin to feel disconnected, not just from people, but from God. Because constant noise drowns out quiet connection. But when you create boundaries, you create space. Space to think. Space to think. Space to reflect. Space to hear. And in that space, God speaks. Sometimes not in words, but in clarity, in direction, in peace, in conviction. And that connection becomes your foundation. And peace, in conviction, and that connection becomes your foundation. Because the stronger your connection with God, the clearer your discernment becomes. You begin to sense when something is not right. You recognize when a relationship is no longer healthy. You feel when a conversation is pulling you away from your values. And instead of ignoring it, you respond. Not with fear, not with guilt, but with wisdom. Because you understand that protecting your spirit is not optional. It is essential. Proverbs 14:7 says, "Stay away from a fool, for you will not find knowledge on their lips." That is direct, that is clear, that is wisdom without apology. And sometimes being wise means creating distance without making announcements. It means quietly stepping back, quietly redirecting your time, quietly choosing peace over unnecessary involvement. Because not everything requires explanation. Not every decision needs approval. And not every decision needs approval. And not every boundary needs to be understood by others to be valid. Being too friendly often makes you over-explain. You feel the need to justify your decisions, to make sure everyone is comfortable, to ensure no one feels offended. But wisdom teaches you that your responsibility is not to manage everyone's feel. Your responsibility is to walk in truth. And truth is not always comfortable. Sometimes it creates distance. Sometimes it exposes differences. Sometimes it exposes differences. Sometimes it reveals misalignment. But that is necessary because alignment determines direction. And direction determines destination. if you continue walking with people who are not aligned with where God is taking you, you will feel constant tension. Not because something is wrong with you, but because your direction is different. Amos 3:3 asks, can two walk together unless they have agreed to do so? Agreement is not just about words, it is about values, vision, direction. And when those things do not align, distance becomes necessary. Not out of pride, but out of purpose. But out of purpose. Being too friendly also keeps you from recognizing your own worth. When you constantly make yourself available, people begin to treat your presence as common. Not because they intend to disrespect you, but because you have removed the sense of value. Access creates familiarity, and too much familiarity can reduce appreciation. But when you establish boundaries, you create respect. You communicate that your time matters, your energy matters, your presence matters, because you matter. And understanding your worth changes how you show up. You no longer chase attention. You no longer settle for shallow connections. You no longer tolerate disrespect disguised as casual behavior, because you know who you are. And more importantly, you know who you are. And more importantly, you know who you are. 1 Peter 2:9 says you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession. That identity carries weight. It carries value. It carries value. It carries purpose. And when you understand it, you stop treating your life as something that can be accessed by everyone. You begin to protect it, honor it, steward it, because it was given to you by God. Too friendly can make you forget that. It can make you treat your life casually. But wisdom brings you back to awareness, back to intention, back to purpose. And as you continue to grow in this, you begin to walk differently. You listen more carefully, you observe more intentionally, you speak more wisely, you choose more deliberately, because you understand that every decision shapes your life and every connection influences your path. And every connection influences your path. So you become selective, not in a way that isolates you, but in a way that strengthens you. You surround yourself with people who add value, who respect your boundaries, who align with your purpose, who encourage your growth. And you create distance from what does not out of judgment, but out of wisdom. Because at the end of the day, your life is too valuable to be lived without intention, too purposeful to be distracted by everything, too meaningful to be given away without discernment, too meaningful to be given away without discernment. And as you continue to walk this path, you realize something powerful, that learning to not be overly friendly was never about pushing people away. It was about finally making room for the right people, the right purpose, and the right peace to remain. And so as you reflect on everything that has been said, understand this clearly. The goal was never to become distant, cold, or disconnected from people. The goal is to become wise, to love with discernment, to give with intention, to walk with clarity, because there is a difference between being available and being assigned. Not everyone who comes into your life is meant to stay. Not everyone who speaks into your life is meant to guide you. And not everyone who desires access to you has been given permission by God to walk closely with you. When you begin to understand this, you stop feeling guilty for protecting your peace. You stop apologizing for setting boundaries. You stop overextending yourself just to maintain approval. Instead, you begin to live with purpose. You begin to value your time. You begin to guard your heart. And you begin to align your relationships with the direction God is taking you. Because your life is not random. It is intentional. It is designed. It is entrusted to you by God. And anything entrusted to you by God, and anything entrusted must be protected. Jesus showed love to all, but he entrusted himself to few. And that balance is the wisdom you are called to walk in. So continue to be kind, continue to be compassionate, continue to reflect God's love, but do it with discernment, with boundaries, with clarity. Because when you stop being too friendly and start being intentional, your life becomes more focused, your relationships become more meaningful, and your spirit becomes more at peace. And in that place of peace, Purpose begins to flourish because you are no longer distracted by everything. You are finally aligned with what truly matters. What truly matters